Hi, welcome. It's June 5th, 2019, and welcome to the Library of Congress. We've just had a wonderful talk on Black Lives Matter and music, and I'd like to welcome Fernando Orjuela, Allison Martin, and Stephanie Shonikin. And thank you for being here. And we just wanted to follow up that very good Botkin lecture with learning a little bit about you and your careers as scholars, and perhaps what you're working on now. So who'd like to start?
Stephanie starts since you're closest.
Okay. I'm Stephanie Shonikan. I am chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts. I've been there just for 1 year. Before this, I was at the University of Missouri. And before that, I was at Columbia College in Chicago. And before that, I was in grad school in Indiana, which is where I met Fernando. Is that all you need to know for this
And
part?
you're an ethnomusicologist.
I'm an ethnomusicologist, yes.
And you and Fernando met at Indiana's
Right.
Department of
Folklore and
At that time, it was
Ethnomusicology.
Department of Folklore, but it has since become the Department of Folklore and
Right.
Ethnomusicology.
We had different paths. We were all trained in folklore, and some of us also specialized in ethnomusicology, which is what I did. And then I have a minor in African American Studies.
Okay. And Allison?
Yes, I'm Allie Martin. I'm a PhD candidate at Indiana in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. I'm on the ethnomusicology side. I'm still very early in my career as I'm still in grad school, but I started as a classically trained violinist at American University, and then I took a class on the musical worlds of DC. In which I quickly realized that if I did not study go-go music in this class about DC music, that no one was going to. So that was my first time doing a project on DC, and I kind of just fell into it from there.
And are you from D.C. originally?
Yes. I'm from Prince George's County, Maryland, which is right outside of the city, east of the city. I grew up in Largo, and then I lived in Bowie for a long time.
And how about you?
My name is Fernando Orjuela, and I started in the folklore program and then discovered ethnomusicology while I was a graduate student. But I proudly wear both hats, folklorist and ethnomusicologist. And I finished my graduate program, enrolled into a position as senior lecturer at Indiana University, where I teach courses mostly in the ethnomusicology program. And then, of course, like Stephanie said, that's where I met her, and we were probably brought together by some faculty members in particular, Ronald Smith, who's an ethnomusicologist, and Dr. Portia Maltby, who's also an ethnomusicologist. And we kind of have those ties with all three of us, and that we are part of a particular community of ethnomusicologists at IU who do Black
And
Botkin
when
music.
did you two first meet?
In 96,
Six for me, yeah.
1996.
I got there in 96.
and I got there in 94.
And did you start off as a musician?
Actually, I studied classical piano for most of my childhood in
And where did you grow up?
Cincinnati, Ohio. And I studied at the conservatory there at the University of Cincinnati. And then money ran out, so I stopped playing. But discovered, I guess, folklore first. I was an English and classics major, and I took a folklore class and discovered that I could study people who look like me and play music like me and do things that are not classical, but treated as art. So that was my first discovery into the disciplines.
And how about you? Were you a musician?
No, not at all. I had gotten a master's, so all my undergrad and my master's degrees are from universities in Nigeria. And my master's my thesis was the study of African American poetry and music. So I looked at Langston Hughes and Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis and Amiri Baraka, right?
But you grew up in Nigeria?
I grew up in Nigeria. First few years in Trinidad, which is where my mother is from, and then later on in Nigeria. So during my master's, I became really intrigued by the ways in which Black people expressed themselves, because myself, I was Black, but I was from two different parts of the Black world, and so that really fascinated me, looking at the Caribbean, looking at West Africa, but also looking at African American music and culture. And so I got my master's in English, but with that focus, and then
From where in
from
Nigeria?
University of Ibadan, which is, in my mind, one of the best in Nigeria, if not the best. And then a professor of mine from Nigeria had come to folklore conference and actually met Ruth Stone at the conference.
Ruth
Stone,
Stone, the
yes.
ethnomusicologist.
Yes, and Ruth Stone, he learned from her about the field of ethnomusicology. And so he contacted me and said, I found the field for you.
Had you ever been to the States before?
Yes, I had. I had been to the States, but I had no idea about ethnomusicology until my professor, who was a folklorist. His name was Isidore Okpehu, who studied African folklore. And so he put me onto it, and I applied and got in. So I'm very grateful for that meeting between Okpehu and Ruth Stone.
So you all met in Indiana?
Yes. Well, Ali is, Alison
She's a
is
current
actually
student right now.
Fernando's student. Yeah.
Yeah, so the co-chairs of my dissertation are actually Ruth Stone and Fernando. So,
That's interesting.
it is.
It's a small little.
Yeah, yeah.
It is, absolutely.
And talk a little bit about this book, Black Lives Matter in Music, which Indiana
University Press.
Press
Yeah.
just put out last year.
That's right.
So what led you to think about writing this?
It happened progressively. In the SEM annual meeting, Stephanie put together a panel for us to talk about Black Lives Matter in music, and it actually involved into certain things that were happening at that particular moment for both of us and the other panelists.
What year was that?
That was 2015, so that was the year really when it started kind of gaining momentum. And then, since that was more of a roundtable discussion, we got together and said, let's do this at the American Folklore Society meeting and write papers about what we kind of fleshed out in a roundtable. And Ali participated at that talk. Langston, who was a Botkin lecturer earlier.
Wilkins?
Langston Wilkins, also an IU graduate in our program, participated in that paper session. And then we were approached by Indiana University immediately, and they wanted to do that book in a very short period of time, very short period of time.
Can you talk a little bit about teaching African American culture at a university level and what the challenges are, the rewards?
So I'm currently the chair of a department that actually is called the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies, and we're really proud of that title, that name.
And that's
because
at University of Massachusetts?
Massachusetts, yes,
and
because
Amherst.
of course Du Bois is from Massachusetts, and he's a proud son, and we're proud to be named after him. But it reminds us that this field is old, right? It's an old field. It's a field that goes back to the late 1800s, when great minds were thinking about the knowledge that was being produced by the experiences of African Americans in this country. So I think of it as a very important field. I think it's a field that I get questions all the time from well-meaning folks about, why don't you just study music in a school of music or in a department of music? Why do you have to have an African American studies department? And my response is always, if I could trust that the schools of music or the English department or the art department would include in their curriculum Black artists, Black composers, Black writers from anywhere in the Black world, then we wouldn't need a department like this. But we're not there yet, right? We do need to have a space where we prioritize the works of people of color, Black folks in particular, from the U.S. and around the world. So it's a field that is incredibly important for all of us. You know, as much as I love to see Black students in my classes, I think it's important for other students to be in those classes too, because Black history is American history, right? I think at this turn, we're in 2019 now, more and more of these departments are sort of widening their scope to include what's now called Africana studies, not just African American, but Africa and the diaspora. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves of the historical connections, but also the nuances between what happened in Africa with colonialism and what happened in the Americas with slavery. And what happened in places like the West Indies, which is part of the Americas, with both colonialism and slavery, right? And what the impact of that is on the people. So yeah, it's a good field. It's an important field, and it needs to be continually supported by the academy.
How about you? You've just started teaching, right?
Yes, I don't have as much teaching experience as anyone used to. But I've really relied on and enjoyed the visibility of being a Black woman teaching Black studies and teaching ethnomusicology, because when I was an undergrad, I had one Black woman professor, and it was for a gen ed class. So it was kind of happenstance that it even happened. And one of the reasons that I came to Indiana specifically was because in ethnomusicology at Indiana, you have people like Portia Mosby and Melanie Burnham and now Alicia Jones and all of these people, and I wanted to be in conversation with them. And so one of the things I do in my classes when we're talking about systemic racism and these kinds of things is I'll be like, raise your hand if you've had 2 or more Black women instructors in your college career. And maybe 1 or 2 people will put their hand up. And I'll say, well, okay, put your hand up if you've had 1 or more, And then I'll say, put your hand down if it's me. And then there's not many hands up because they just, for some of them, I'm the only Black woman that they will have as a professor. And I'm a graduate student. And so I really sort of lean on that kind of visibility because it's really important to see someone like me, as a teacher in this space.
Well, for me, my experience is a little bit different. With regards to what I teach in particular, especially with Black popular music, it came up a little bit in the conversation after the discussion, or after the talks, about talking about Black music to students who are interested or consumers of it, and for hip hop in particular, since 1992, 72 to 75% of the consumption has been by a white population. So it is this generation's popular music, and not having a connection to why you do the sounds that you make, or why you say the things that you do, why you rhyme the way you rhyme. Those kind of disconnections are just not part of what culture studies about African American and African music making is all about. And so it is more than just being a subculturist and attaching yourselves because you are connected to the scene because it's on trend. But it's probably, for me, more important to understand that this is rooted in cultural manifestations of what West African music making is all about in comparison to what you might have learned in the music department of what European music theory is all about. And so to diversify the ways in which we think about music, think about art, think about literature, culture, as being part of a global system of meanings as opposed to just isolating it to the Europeanists that we get in our traditional classes. As an English major and a classics major, so for me, even taking an American, this is back in the 80s, taking an American lit course, a survey of American literature course, I didn't have a single author who was a person of color. And that's 1980s. So we did have a lot of Black authors that we could have used. We could have Latino authors that we could have used, Asian authors that we could have used to talk about the American experience. But that was exactly right. That is exactly why we do need departments of minority studies, minorities in this country, because that can still happen. in education today.
Do you think things are getting better? More diverse or staying the same?
A
or-
little bit, I would say yes, but I also am confronted with those people who have to teach these kind of courses, this kind of literature. I wrote a kind of a handbook on the history of rap music and hip hop culture, and it is targeting, music school folks who are required now, not by choice, but required to teach a popular music course, especially rap music, because that will bring
And what's
students
the title?
rap music and hip hop culture. So that's the book that I put together, but it is meant for an audience of teachers who are more required to teach it, don't really have the investment in the culture, but recognize the fact that to diversify the scope of music in a music school, they need to teach classes like this.
Do you find that your students, especially white students who love rap music, are interested or aware of its origins or the cultural connections?
In my experience, and you guys can chime in too, they usually are a little bit more shocked when they come into the classroom after they've been in it for a while. It's like, oh, this is not what I thought this class was going to be about. I thought we were just going to talk about Jay-Z and the songs, my favorite songs, basically.
Yeah.
Music appreciation.
Is it like an easy credit for?
An easy credit,
yeah.
but also fun, because
Yeah.
this is the music that I listen to, and not recognize the fact that when I say toasting the DJ in that tradition, in the live components of the 1970s, it has a history that goes back to storytelling in African American 1800s, maybe even 1700s tradition of celebrating an outlaw type figure, a person who's bold enough to stand up against anyone. And it's like, okay, and that kind of follows through even reversioning itself in gangster rappers or hardcore rappers, personas and narratives.
I think there's often a pushback from students who view this music as simply beat, like it's just a beat, it's a good beat. You don't have to make a big statement out of everything that you teach, and so I think it's important to remind them that actually this music has a really strong message that you should listen for as well. Yeah, sure, enjoy the beat, but also listen to what these young artists have to say about the world that they're living in, whether you're listening to Snoop Dogg or Kendrick, right? Compton is a place that most of you who buy this music will never go to, have never been to, and you need to listen to what they have to say about the community that they grew up in. So I think recently, I just saw this on social media, Yo-Yo Ma said something about music and art has never been for art's sake, that it should do more. And so one of my colleagues in the School of Music was just thrilled and excited about that message, to which I kind of rolled my eyes and said, well, we've been saying this, those of us who study African American music have been saying, within schools of music, have been saying that we need to get our students to really think about, even if it's jazz, about what does it mean that jazz is from New Orleans or from St. Louis or Kansas City? What are these artists? How is the sound of the jazz and the structure of the jazz different in these 3 places or 4 places or whatever? And what does that say about the ways in which people live in those places, and how can we better understand the diversity of Black life, right? So the music has always been about doing more than just giving you a sonic entertainment, right? And sometimes I think back to your question, Nancy. I think often students kind of push back on that and are startled that this is actually a serious field of study. I always tell them that the music that we are listening to in this class should be taken as seriously as a Shakespeare play, right? And I want you to listen to it with as much intent and intentionality as you would a text in one of your STEM classes, you know, and it takes a little prodding, but they come around to it.
One of the things you made me think about it when you said art for art's sake. One of the things I do in my classes on the first or second, class meeting is talk about tattoos and ask anyone if they have tattoos or tattoo ideas that they would like to share. And sometimes you'll get a ton of people talk, and I mean they talk about
And they
really,
love to talk about that, right?
and they're talking about grief and people that they've loved and places that they love and all these really intense things. And then I'll talk about mine. And then we get into this conversation about how art is not for art's sake, because here's this art that we bear in our bodies and it's really important to us. So immediately we're like,
That's awesome. Yeah.
we're doing this thing here.
So using it to get into culture and art and meaning.
And meaning, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, because
All the
they
symbols.
have really, in-depth stories about family and friends and place. And,
That's a great way to get into it.
And also ways of talking or approaching it, and it's like insider, outsider information, because may I see your wrist?
Oh, yes.
I mean, this may be important to some folks and know exactly what that means, and then others might not have a clue what that means. It's like, that's an interesting scribble.
Yeah, yeah. So they're always like, oh, are you going to talk about yours? I'm like, yeah, I'll talk about mine.
But you talk about yours first.
Right?
Right.
So what are you working on now? What's next for you?
So I'm really excited. I'm working on 3 different things. One, of course, is the class I talked about in the lecture, Race and the American Story. My colleague Adam and I are working on Adam Seagrave.
And where is Adam?
He's at Arizona State University, and he's a political science scholar. And then, so he and I are working on that project, and the students gave us so much rich information, and they've given us the permission to publish it.
Just for this interview, could you reiterate
Sure.
the description of the class?
Yes. It's the name of the class is Race and the American Story, and we created this at Mizzou,
Which is
University of Missouri, because Adam and I both taught there at the time, and we were both we wanted to challenge ourselves to figure out a way to get beyond the hashtags and to get beyond the little tweets that were coming out from every
And
angle.
this was a very tense time at University of
Yes,
Missouri.
it was. So we created this course, opened it up to, it was a 1-credit course. We had texts from the Declaration of Independence all the way to the Obama race speech, and students were taken on this journey, and the classes, we had 5 sections, they all filled, so we knew there was a hunger for more of an engagement in this kind of discourse. So we taught it then, and then when we both moved, he moved to Arizona State, I moved to Massachusetts, we decided to continue teaching it, knowing that we would have very different students in these two states. And we brought them to a symposium in April in Arizona. We brought them all together in a room for a whole day.
So you were simultaneously teaching it throughout the semester?
Yes, and then and we had the same syllabus, and then we came together, and so the students were really fascinated by each other's points of reference and points of their own worldviews from different worlds, really, in the United States. And so Adam and I are working on that project. We're going to continue it. So that's one. The second thing I'm working on right now is the Max Roach album. We Insist. I'm working on a project, a book that kind of frames that album as a really important album to Africana studies. And then lastly, I'm working on a project with a friend, a colleague, on the notion of skin bleaching in Africa, and thinking about the psychological effects of colonialism that is manifested in women bleaching their skin to get lighter. So it's 3 very different projects, but it keeps me on my toes for sure.
And how about you, Allie? What's next for you?
Dissertation.
Dissertation. And the topic of your dissertation is?
Yeah, so my main focus right now is finishing my dissertation. That dissertation is tentatively entitled Sonic Intersections, Listening to Gentrification in Washington, D.C. And so when I listen to gentrification, I'm thinking about a number of different things. That could be displacement of go-go music that I was talking about today. I also have done a lot of work with soundscapes and thinking about, you know, the environment and how gentrification has really shifted the soundscapes of these neighborhoods. Some of this is about legislation, things like the Amplified Noise Act in D.C. So all of these things sort of coming together and how we listen to them in D.C. specifically.
And I know there's a member of your committee here, so I will just assume that it's going very well, and
It's
you're
just going very
almost
well.
done.
I think it's going well.
But I'm sure it's
She's
going well.
going at a very fast
But-
pace. I'm actually
but-
telling her to slow down.
Do you see your future as teaching in higher education, or?
Well, I mean, you know, the job market is a job market, so we'll see what happens. I like to do a lot of different things. I really, really enjoy teaching, and I enjoy any time I get the chance to teach, be it a guest lecture somewhere or a full class. But I also spent a year as a fellow at the Smithsonian at the Anacostia Community Museum, and I really enjoyed, you know, any kind of curatorship and that kind of work. And I also think that the work that I'm doing specifically is useful for the public. Because one thing that has happened to me in, you know, in the time that I've been in grad school is that some things I knew, but I didn't have the language for. And so where I knew things about go-go, you know, 5-6 years ago, I didn't have a language of the criminalization of Black sound. And so I'm trying to think of ways that my work can be useful to give people language to talk about things that they already know. But maybe, you know, aren't legible to, you know, the bodies that they need to be legible to. So I'm open to a lot of different things, you know, I'm looking.
Just putting it out there.
Just putting it out there, you know, but we'll see.
You'll find something. And how about you?
For me, well, I just completed 2 projects. But I started my program as a graduate student. I only intended on stopping at the master's and working in museums. So I had an opportunity to work with 2 museums projects. One was at the Carnegie Hall as a music specialist for the hip hop section.
At Carnegie Hall
At
in
Carnegie
New York?
Hall in New York. Portia Malsby's, we're working from a framework that she had created as far as the history and mapping of African American music since their arrival. But I also participated as a hip hop specialist for the National Museum of African American Music in Nashville. So I just completed those 2 projects, and I teach a class on youth music scenes and social movements. And it's interesting that you brought up the hashtag business, because I teach 3 sections on Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and then Never Again. And they're very different, and it's a very contemporary youth music scene that doesn't work in the same way that social movements have worked in the past. Black Lives Matter as a movement has had that connection that is more familiar to us from the 1960s civil rights movements, but the Me Too movement is far more diverse. There is no real soundtrack, but if we look at every musical genre, there's an example that talks about these issues. The Never Again movement is even smaller, but at the same time, it speaks to a lot of young people, teenagers in particular, who've been the most active in protesting, in challenging legislators, challenging city, their neighborhoods, their own parents. So musically, that is kind of evolving as well. In Parkland, in Florida, we have the children themselves writing their own music for themselves. And then we have outsiders who've been also engaging with talking about the issues. Not directly, but it's present. So that's slowly happening. I'm looking and anxious to see where that goes, because, like I said, they don't tend to consolidate in the ways they may have in movements in the past, because they are communicating in different formats, mostly in social media, but they are finding their connections through that format. So that's research projects are fairly new and still exploratory.
Sounds interesting. Now, what haven't I asked you about? What else should we know about you all?
I think you asked us how we got into our program, or how we got into the things that we were doing.
Yeah. Have you ever done rap yourself?
I actually, in one of the other classes, I teach 2 hip-hop classes.
Yeah.
One's a large lecture with 270, and one's a small one with 30, and we actually do have a rap battle in that class. So we all, and sometimes they make me rap too. I'm not very good at it. My specialties were more on the
Oh,
graffiti
my
side
gosh.
and the dancing. So we'll also go on the dance floor and I'll teach them some moves. I do it in slow motion. I mean, can't show you now, but I got my 2 knee pads on because age happens, and that's a dance form for
So you're
young
more
people.
yeah.
But we'll get down on the floor, and I'll teach them some moves, and then, like I said, we'll go out and we'll do some graffiti, and not out in public, but on the chalkboard. So we do play with all 4 elements in a smaller environment classroom. So that's my experience with
Did you
hip-hop.
pick this up in Cincinnati?
Yeah.
I asked us a New Yorker, but
Well, I have some newer connections, but
Yeah.
no, 79, 6th grade, rap music became a national phenomenon.
Yeah,
It
it
seemed
did.
like it was just going to be a fad. But Sugar Hill's Rappers Delight, every kid worth their mustard knew all 14 and a half minutes of those verses from beginning
And
to
I was in
end.
Africa, and I learned all
Yeah,
those
you have
verses
to.
as well.
Uh,
Sure did.
It's one of those things that you still,
Yeah.
I can probably still recite at least half of them now. But, and I also didn't do that in classrooms just because they kind of forget that, yeah, everyone had to do that because that's what kids did, and it was a trend, and that's what introduced you first to the music. But then when you realize that that was a commercial product that had nothing to do with the culture, and then you all of a sudden, they're connected to the dancing, connected to the graffiti writing, and that there were DJs actually involved. Because we had studio musicians doing that in the earliest days. And yeah, so once you connect the dots and recognize the brokenness of the rapping, the brokenness of the sampled art, the brokenness of the shattered glass look of the wild style graffiti, the brokenness of the movements in the dance, it's thematically South Bronx broken neighborhood turned into a beautiful art form. And so it's progressive. But yeah, it was introduced to me by the commercial product first.
interesting. Interesting. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and we can continue this, but I think what we'll do is have you back in a couple of years and see where you are with your different
Okay.
projects. But thank you all for coming.
Thank
This has
you,
been great to
Nancy.
talk to you.
Appreciate
Thank you.
it. Thank you.
for hosting us.